In the autumn of 1622, a young man stood in a room in the royal palace in Madrid, preparing pigments he had ground that morning, and across from him, seated in a chair that had been positioned to catch the northern light, sat the most powerful man in Europe, a king barely 17 years old, pale and tired, and watching him with an expression that contained neither expectation nor curiosity, only the particular stillness of someone who had learned early that his face belonged to history before it belonged to him. The young man's name was Diego Velazquez. He was 23 years old. He had been in Madrid less than a year, and he was about to paint the first of many portraits that would, over the course of 3 decades, transform the way a human being could appear in paint, not as symbol or ideal, but as the quiet, irreducible fact of presence itself. But that moment was still ahead. To understand how we arrived there, we need to go back further, to the south, to Seville, to the narrow streets and whitewashed walls of a city that was, in the last years of the 16th century, the wealthiest and most crowded port in Spain, the gateway through which the silver of the New World poured into Europe, and the place where Diego Rodriguez de Silva y Velázquez was born in June of 1599, baptized at the church of San Pedro on the 6th of that month, the first child of Juan Rodriguez de Silva and Gerona Velázquez, whose pawn in term and tumbles nothing in terms of mud, and un mauve dependez road. Seville in those years was a city of contrasts so sharp they seemed designed to teach a young painter about light and shadow before he ever picked up a brush. There were the great houses of merchants grown rich on the Indies trade, their courtyards filled with orange trees and the sound of fountains, and there were the tenements pressed so close together that sunlight reached the street only at midday. There were churches filled with gold leaf and paintings shipped from Italy and Flanders, and there were beggars on every corner. The city's population had swelled to more than 100,000 souls, making it one of the largest cities in Europe, and with that growth came plague and poverty, and a kind of feverish energy that seemed to Velázquez, even as a child, to contain both magnificence and rot in equal measure. He was the eldest of 8 children, though not all of them survived. His father's family came from Portugal, minor nobility who had settled in Seville a generation earlier. His mother's family, the Velázquez line, was also hidalgo, also modest in means. It was from his mother's surname that he would take his professional name, Diego Velázquez, a choice that suggests something about the fluidity of identity in that world, the way even a name could be a tool, a way of shaping how one appeared. What do we know about his childhood? Very little, and what little we know comes mostly from legal documents, baptismal records, the dry administrative trace of a life not yet worth recording in any other way. We know that he could read and write, which means he received some basic education, likely from a local priest or tutor. We know that by the time he was 10 or 11, his parents had apprenticed him to a painter, because that was what you did if your son showed an aptitude for drawing, and you were a family of modest means and good name. You found him a trade that might allow him to rise without dishonoring his lineage. The first apprenticeship did not take. The painter's name was Francisco de Herrera the Elder, a successful artist with a workshop in Seville, and accounts suggest he was a difficult man, temperamental and harsh. Velázquez stayed with him less than a year. In December of 1610, when Velázquez was 11 years old, his father signed a new contract of apprenticeship, this time with a painter named Francisco Pacheco, and this time the arrangement would hold. Pacheco was 40 years old, a man of learning and modest talent, respected more for his intellectual rigor than for the originality of his paintings. He ran a workshop that was also a kind of academy, a place where young men learned not only how to grind pigments and stretch canvases and render the human figure according to the classical proportions, but also how to think about painting as a liberal art, something worthy of a gentleman's attention, not merely a craft. Pacheco was writing a treatise. He would spend most of his life writing it, called The Art of Painting, in which he laid out his theories about technique, iconography, the proper subject matter for religious art. He believed in rules. He believed in decorum. He believed that painting should be clear, legible, morally instructive. And into his household in the winter of 1610 came a boy who would learn everything Pacheco had to teach, and then, slowly, patiently, over the course of decades, undo almost all of it. The apprenticeship was standard for the time, 6 years, during which Velázquez would live in Pacheco's house, eat at his table, learn his methods, assist with his commissions, and in exchange receive training, shelter, and eventually the certification that would allow him to practice as a master painter himself. The contract stipulated that Pacheco would teach him the said art of painting with all its techniques, and that Velázquez would serve him faithfully and keep his secrets, meaning the particular recipes for pigments and varnishes that each workshop guarded. Pacheco's house was on the Calle de la Grauela in the parish of San Vicente. It was a place of serious conversation and careful study. Pacheco had gathered around him a circle of poets, scholars, and clerics men, who wrote sonnets, debated theology, discussed the latest arrivals from Italy. The painter himself was a member of Seville's intellectual elite, connected to the university, to the church, to the noble families who commissioned altarpieces for the city's many churches and convents. To be apprenticed to Pacheco was to enter not just a workshop, but a world, a network of ideas and patronage that might, if you were talented and lucky, carry you beyond the limits of your birth. And Velázquez was talented. Even by the standards of Pacheco's workshop, where the training was rigorous and the expectations high, the boy showed an unusual aptitude. He could draw with precision and speed. He had a steady hand and a good eye for proportion. But more than that, and this is something Pacheco himself would later note with a mixture of pride and puzzlement, he was interested in things that most young painters ignored. He wanted to paint ordinary objects, eggs in a pan, a jug of water, a piece of fish on a plate. He wanted to study how light moved across a surface, how shadow pooled in the hollow of a cheek, how a white cloth could contain a dozen different tones of white depending on the angle of the light and the color of the wall behind it. This was strange. This was not what you were supposed to care about if you wanted to make a name for yourself in Seville in the early 1600s. What you were supposed to care about was religious painting, altarpieces, devotional images, scenes from the lives of the saints. That was where the money was and the prestige. That was what the church needed, and the church was the primary patron of the arts. Still life bodegones, as they were called in Spanish, literally tavern scenes, were considered a low genre, fit for northern painters maybe, the Dutch and Flemish who liked to show off their technical skill by rendering a bunch of grapes so carefully you could almost taste them, but not for a serious Spanish painter with aspirations to greatness. But Velázquez kept painting them. During his years with Pacheco and in the years immediately after he completed his apprenticeship, he produced a series of these bodegones that are unlike anything else being made in Spain at the time. There is one called Old Woman Cooking Eggs, painted around 1618 when he was 19 years old. It shows an old woman, her face deeply lined, her head scarf white, bending over a small charcoal brazier on which a clay bowl sits. And in the bowl 2 eggs are frying in oil, the whites just beginning to turn opaque, and beside her stands a boy, maybe 10 or 12 years old, holding a melon in one hand and a flask of wine in the other. That is the whole painting. No story, no allegory, no moral lesson. Just an old woman cooking eggs. Except that is not quite right, because the painting is not just about an old woman cooking eggs. It is about the way light falls on the white of the egg and makes it glow against the dark earthenware of the bowl. It is about the texture of the old woman's skin, the way age has folded it into lines and shadows, and the way that texture is different from the smooth skin of the boy, and different again from the rough weave of her apron. It is about the weight of the flask, the coolness of the melon, the heat rising from the brazier. It is about the fact that these things, these ordinary, humble, utterly unremarkable things are worth looking at slowly and carefully, that they have a kind of dignity simply by virtue of existing, and that painting can give them a presence as complete and undeniable as any saint or king. This is the seed of everything Velázquez would later do. This attention, this refusal to look away from what is actually there in favor of what is supposed to be there. Already at 19 he is less interested in the ideal than in the real, less interested in beauty as a classical standard than in the particular beauty of specificity, of a thing rendered so exactly that it becomes more than itself, not a symbol, not a type, just irreducibly this egg, this face, this light. He completed his apprenticeship in March of 1617 and was examined by the Painters' Guild of Seville, the Gremio, and admitted as a master painter, authorized to practice his art, take on apprentices, and open his own workshop. He was 17 years old, young even by the standards of the time, and a little over a year later, in April of 1618, he married Juana Pacheco, his master's daughter, in a ceremony at the church of San Miguel. She was 16. We know almost nothing about her. No letters survive. No descriptions beyond the barest facts of births and deaths. She appears in the archive only as a name in a contract, a witness to a will, the mother of 2 daughters. Whether she loved him, whether she understood what he was trying to do in his paintings, whether she resented the years he would spend at court while she remained in Seville, we have no way of knowing. She is a silence at the center of his life, and there is no way to fill it honestly except to acknowledge it. They had their first daughter, Francisca, in 1619, and a second, Ignacia, in 1621. By then Velázquez had his own household to support, his own workshop, and a growing reputation in Seville. He was painting religious subjects now. He had to make a living, but even in those early religious works, you can see him bringing the same attention he had brought to the eggs and the fish. A painting of the Adoration of the Magi from around 1619 shows the Holy Family and the 3 kings in rich, carefully rendered costumes, but the faces are not idealized. They are specific, individual, modeled with the same careful attention to light and shadow that he had used on the old woman in the Bodegón. The Virgin Mary, according to some accounts, was modeled on Juana. The Christ child is a real baby, plump and squirming, not a miniature adult. The painting is devout, but it is also grounded in the world as it actually appears. And yet, for all his growing skill, for all the commissions and the respect of his peers, Seville was not enough. It was a provincial city, however wealthy. The real power, the real patronage, the real art was elsewhere. In Madrid, at the court of Philip IV, who had become king in 1621 at the age of 16, there was a need for painters, and a tradition of bringing the best talents from across Europe to serve the crown. Titian had painted for Philip's great-grandfather. Rubens had visited. If Velázquez wanted to be more than a successful provincial painter, if he wanted to test himself against the best, he needed to go to Madrid. He made his first attempt in the spring of 1622, traveling to the capital with letters of introduction from Pacheco, who had connections at court through his intellectual circle. The trip was not a success. He managed to paint a portrait of the great poet Luis de Góngora, then living in Madrid, but he did not secure a position at court. He returned to Seville that summer, disappointed but not defeated. And then, in the autumn of that year, he received word that the king's chief minister, the Count Duke of Olivares, who happened to be from Seville and who had heard of Velázquez's talent, wanted him to return to Madrid. The king needed a portrait painted. Velázquez left Seville in October of 1622 and arrived in Madrid a few weeks later. He was given lodgings, provided with materials, and granted a sitting with the king. What did Philip IV see when he looked at this young painter from Seville? Probably not much. He was 17, pale, with the prominent lower lip that was the mark of the Habsburg family, the result of generations of intermarriage designed to keep power and bloodlines pure. He had been king for less than 2 years. His father, Philip III, had been a weak ruler, more interested in hunting and piety than in governance, and had left the running of the kingdom to his favorite, the Duke of Lerma. When Philip IV came to the throne, he had placed his trust in Olivares, a brilliant, ambitious, and ruthless man who was determined to restore Spain to its former greatness, to reverse the long decline that had begun in the previous century when the empire's ambitions had outpaced its resources. Philip sat for Velázquez, and Velázquez painted him. The portrait does not survive, or if it does, we cannot identify it with certainty among the many royal portraits Velázquez would paint over the next 30 years, but we know that it was successful, because in October of 1623, Velázquez was officially appointed Pintor del Rey, painter to the king, with a salary and lodgings in the royal palace. He sent for Juana and his daughters, and they joined him in Madrid. He was 24 years old. He would spend the rest of his life in the service of the king, painting the royal family and the court, and he would almost never return to Seville. This is the core tension of Velázquez's life, and it is present from this moment on. He was a court painter, which meant he was a servant. However much respect he was given, however much his talent was valued, he was employed by the king, dependent on the king's favor, required to paint what the king wanted painted, when the king wanted it painted. In the rigid social hierarchy of 17th-century Spain, a painter was a craftsman, no different in kind from a tailor or a carpenter. He worked with his hands. He was paid a salary. He was not a gentleman, not a noble, no matter how much natural nobility his art might suggest. And Velázquez, the son of hidalgos, a man who had married his master's daughter and moved in intellectual circles, wanted to be more than a craftsman. He wanted the recognition that his art deserved, and he wanted the social status that would place him among the nobles and courtiers he painted. This desire would shape his life as much as his painting. He would spend decades lobbying for appointments, honors, positions that would elevate him in the eyes of the world. He would paint portraits that humanized kings and queens, that rendered them with a dignity and depth that no official portrait required, and he would do so while himself seeking the recognition that his subjects held by birth. But that struggle was still ahead. In 1623, he was simply a young painter with steady work and royal favor, learning the routines of court life. The royal Alcázar in Madrid was a sprawling palace, a warren of rooms and courtyards, galleries and chapels, and somewhere in its depths Velázquez was given a studio. He set up his easel, arranged his brushes, and began the work of painting the king and his family. Over the next few years, he painted Philip again and again, portrait after portrait, the king aging from a pale youth into a pale young man, his expression rarely changing, that same stillness, that same patient endurance of being looked at. What is remarkable about these early court portraits is how little they flatter. Velázquez was not painting icons. He was painting a person. The king's face is long, his jaw heavy, his eyes tired. In some portraits, he wears the elaborate costume of a Habsburg monarch, black velvet, white ruff, the chain of the golden fleece. In others, he is dressed more simply, almost plainly. But in all of them, there is a sense of presence, of a man occupying space, breathing, thinking, enduring. It is as if Velázquez is asking the same question of Philip that he had asked of the old woman cooking eggs. What does it mean to look closely at this person, to see them as they are, without apology or embellishment? This approach was unusual. Most court portraits of the period were exercises in propaganda. They were meant to project power, authority, divine right. The sitter was posed in a way that emphasized their status. The costume was painted in meticulous detail to show the wealth and taste of the court. The face was idealized, made more beautiful, more commanding, more regal than the actual person. But Velázquez did not idealize. He clarified. He painted what he saw, and what he saw was not the symbol of monarchy, but the man inside the symbol, the weight of the role pressing down on a young man's shoulders. This honesty could have been dangerous. Kings did not usually want to be seen as merely human. But Philip, for whatever reason, allowed it, Perhaps he trusted Velázquez. Perhaps he did not care how he appeared, as long as the portraits were made. Or perhaps, and this is the more interesting possibility, he saw in Velázquez's portraits something closer to the truth than the flattery of other painters, and he valued that truth, even if it complicated the image of majesty he was supposed to project. Philip and Velázquez were almost exactly the same age. Philip was born in April of 1605, Velázquez in June of 1599. And over the years they would develop a relationship that was, within the constraints of their respective positions, something like a friendship. The king granted Velázquez privileges unusual for a court painter: a studio in the palace, the freedom to paint without constant supervision, the right to refuse certain commissions. Velázquez in turn gave the king his complete loyalty, not just as a servant but as an artist who understood that his role was to make the king visible, to create the image by which Philip would be remembered. But in those early years, Velázquez was still learning. He was learning the rhythms of court life, the delicate politics of patronage, the way to navigate the jealousies and rivalries of the other artists and courtiers. He was also learning, or beginning to learn, that his talent had limits he had not yet tested. The Bodegones had been one kind of achievement, technical, observational, grounded in the here and now. The court portraits were another, psychological, subtle, requiring an understanding of character and presence. But what he had not yet done, what he had not yet been able to do in Seville or in his first years in Madrid, was to see the great works of the past, to stand in front of the paintings of the Italian masters and understand what painting could be when it reached beyond observation into something larger, something more mysterious. That opportunity came in 1629, when Peter Paul Rubens arrived in Madrid. Rubens was 52 years old, at the height of his fame and power. He was not just a painter but a diplomat, sent by the Archduchess Isabella of the Spanish Netherlands to negotiate with Philip's court. He was also, by any measure, the most celebrated painter in Europe, a man whose work combined the grandeur of the Italian Renaissance with the energy and color of the Northern Baroque, whose canvases were enormous and exuberant, full of flesh and motion and drama. He stayed in Madrid for 9 months, and during that time he and Velázquez met, talked, and almost certainly visited the royal collection together. The royal collection was extraordinary. Philip's predecessors had been avid collectors, and the walls of the Alcázar were hung with works by Titian, Tintoretto, Veronese, Raphael, and dozens of others. Velázquez had access to these paintings. He had been copying them, studying them. But it was one thing to look at them alone, and another to look at them with Rubens, who had studied in Italy, who had copied Titian himself, who understood the techniques of the Venetian masters in a way that no Spanish painter did. We do not know what they talked about, but we can guess from what Velázquez did next. In the summer of 1629, not long after Rubens left Madrid, Velázquez petitioned the king for permission to travel to Italy. Permission was granted. He was given funds, letters of introduction, and leave from his duties. In August of 1629, he left Madrid, traveling first to Barcelona, then by ship to Genoa, and from there south through Italy. He was 30 years old. He had been painting for nearly 2 decades, and he was already a master, but he was about to learn what he did not yet know. Italy in 1629 was not the Italy of the High Renaissance. That moment had passed a century earlier. But the works remained, and the cities that had produced them, Venice, Florence, Rome, were still centers of art and learning, still places where a painter could see things not available anywhere else. Velázquez spent more than a year traveling through Italy. He went to Venice and saw the works of Titian, Tintoretto, and Veronese in the churches and palaces where they had been painted. He went to Rome and was given lodgings in the Vatican, where he could study the frescoes of Raphael and Michelangelo at his leisure. He went to Naples and met the Spanish viceroy, who welcomed him and showed him the collections there. What did he see? What did he learn? We have no letters, no journal, no direct record of his thoughts. But we can see the effect in the paintings he made after he returned. Something had changed. His technique had loosened, become more fluid. His palette had warmed. He was using color in a new way, not as local color, the color of the thing itself, but as a way of suggesting light and atmosphere, the way Titian had. He was building forms not through careful outline and shading, as Pacheco had taught him, but through the accumulation of brushstrokes, each one laid down with a kind of confident spontaneity that suggested the thing without describing it completely. If you stood close to one of his canvases now, you would see something almost abstract, dabs and streaks of paint that did not resolve into anything recognizable. But step back, and suddenly there it was, a face, a hand, the shimmer of silk, the weight of velvet. This is the Venetian technique, the technique of Titian in his late years, when he had stopped caring about finish and started caring only about truth, about the way paint could become light, could become air, could become the substance of the visible world, without ever pretending to be anything other than paint. Velázquez had seen it, and now he understood it. He had found his language. He returned to Madrid in January of 1631, after more than a year away, and he brought with him a new confidence, a new ambition. He resumed his duties at court, painting the king and the royal family, but now the portraits had a depth and richness they had not had before. The paint was more alive. The figures breathed. The space around them seemed to shimmer with light. In 1631, his daughter Francisca married Juan Bautista Martínez del Mazo, a young painter who had been working in Velázquez's studio. Mazo would become his assistant, his collaborator, and eventually his heir, taking over his position as court painter after his death. The marriage was a practical arrangement. Such marriages often were, but it also suggests that Velázquez had begun to think about legacy, about what would happen to his work and his position after he was gone. In 1634, Philip's new palace, the Buen Retiro, was nearing completion on the eastern edge of Madrid, and Velázquez was commissioned to paint a series of portraits of the royal family on horseback to decorate the Great Hall. These were not small portraits. They were enormous canvases, nearly life-sized, showing the king, the queen, the young Prince Baltasar Carlos, all mounted on prancing horses, dressed in armor or court costume, set against landscapes that suggested the vastness of the Spanish Empire. They were propaganda, yes, but they were also something more. Velázquez painted the horses with a tenderness and attention that made them as much the subject as the riders. He painted the landscape, the mountains in the distance, the sky streaked with clouds with the same care he had once given to a jug of water or a piece of fish. Even in a work designed to glorify the monarchy, he could not help but attend to the particularity of things, the way light moved, the way a horse's neck curved, the way a child sat in the saddle, with a mixture of pride and uncertainty. The portrait of Prince Baltasar Carlos is especially moving. The boy was born in 1629, and by 1634 he was 5 years old, the heir to the throne, the future of the Habsburg dynasty. Velázquez painted him on a pony, a small bay with a nervous eye, and the boy is dressed in miniature armor, holding a baton of command, his sash embroidered with gold. He looks solemn, trying to live up to the role. But he is still a child, and Velázquez does not hide that. The armor is too big. The pony is too small. The boy's face is round and soft, his eyes wide. He is trying to be a prince, but he is also just a boy on a pony, and Velázquez lets both things be true at once. Baltasar Carlos would die in 1646 at the age of 17, and his death would break Philip's heart and throw the succession into chaos. But in 1634 he was the hope of Spain, and Velázquez painted him with a gentleness that suggests he saw not just the prince, but the child, not just the future king, but the boy who might not live long enough to become one. This is the other quality that begins to emerge in Velázquez's work in the 1630s, something beyond technical mastery, beyond observation, a kind of compassion, a willingness to see his subjects as vulnerable, as human, as more than the roles they inhabited. It is there in the portraits of the royal family, and it is even more pronounced in the portraits he painted of the court dwarfs and jesters, the men and women who lived at court to entertain the king and his guests, whose physical difference made them objects of curiosity and amusement. The court of Philip IV, like most European courts of the period, employed a number of dwarfs and people with disabilities. They were called buffoons, jesters, sometimes simply playthings. They were dressed in costumes given nicknames, expected to perform. They were not quite servants and not quite companions, occupying a strange liminal space in the court hierarchy, tolerated and even valued for their ability to amuse, but never granted the dignity of being seen as fully human. Velázquez painted them. He painted them as he painted the king, with the same attention, the same care, the same refusal to look away. There is a portrait of a man known as Sebastian de Mora, painted around 1643 to 1644. He is sitting on the floor, his legs splayed out in front of him, his arms resting on his knees, looking directly out at the viewer. He is dressed in dark green and red, courtly colors, and his face is serious, even severe. He has a broad forehead, deep-set eyes, a strong jaw. There is no pity in the portrait, no sentimentality, no attempt to make him a symbol of suffering or resilience. He is simply himself, present, dignified, returning the viewer's gaze with an intensity that refuses to be diminished by the circumstances of his life. Or there is the portrait of Francisco Lexano, called El Niño de Velázquez, the boy from Velázquez, painted around 1636 to 1638. He is sitting outdoors on a hillside, playing with a deck of cards. He has a round face, a gentle expression, and his body is twisted in a way that suggests some physical impairment. But again, Velázquez does not make his disability the subject of the portrait. He paints him as a boy at play, absorbed in his game, the landscape soft and golden behind him. The painting is tender, almost protective, as if Velázquez is trying to give this boy a moment of privacy, a moment in which he is not being stared at, not being judged, just being stared at, not being judged. These portraits are among the most extraordinary achievements of 17th-century painting. They are political in a way that has nothing to do with propaganda and everything to do with recognition. Velázquez is using the tools of court portraiture, the formal composition, the careful rendering, the dignified pose to grant these men and women the same presence, the same humanity that he grants the king. He is saying simply by painting them this way, that they matter, that their faces and their lives are worth attending to, that they are not curiosities or entertainment, but people. This is the work of an artist who understood servitude from the inside. Velázquez was himself a servant, however elevated his position, however close his relationship with the king. He was dependent on royal favor, subject to the whims and demands of the court. He could be dismissed, replaced, forgotten. His work was not his own in the way that, say, a painter working independently in Amsterdam might have claimed his work was his own. Velázquez painted what the king wanted him to paint, when the king wanted it painted. And yet, within those constraints, he found a way to make paintings that were his own, that carried his vision, that insisted on a kind of truth that no one was asking for, but that he gave anyway. The 1640s were the most productive decade of his life. He was painting constantly portraits of the king, the queen, the infantas, the young prince. He was also taking on more administrative duties at court. In 1643, he was appointed ayuda de cámara, assistant to the chamber, a position that gave him more access to the king and more responsibility for the day-to-day functioning of the royal household. In 1647, he was appointed to accompany the king's household when Philip traveled to Aragon to suppress a rebellion. In 1649, he was appointed aposentador de palacio, palace chamberlain, responsible for overseeing the royal lodgings and later for organizing the elaborate ceremonies and festivities that accompanied royal weddings and state occasions. These were honors, but they were also burdens. They took time away from painting. They required him to manage servants, negotiate with suppliers, settle disputes, handle logistics. With settle disputes, handle logistics. They were not the work of an artist, but the work of an administrator. and they suggest both the high regard in which Philip held him and the extent to which Velázquez was willing to take on these duties in exchange for status and security. But they also suggest something else. Velázquez's ambition was not just to paint, but to rise, to transform himself from a craftsman into a gentleman, to secure a place in the world that matched his sense of his own worth. This ambition was not ignoble, it was a recognition of the injustice of a system that valued birth over merit, but it was also, in some sense, a distraction. Every hour he spent organizing lodgings or settling accounts was an hour not spent in the studio, and yet he could not refuse. To refuse would have been to risk losing the king's favor, and without that favor he was nothing. In 1649, Velázquez was given permission to travel to Italy again, this time on a mission for the king. Philip wanted to acquire paintings and sculptures for the royal collection, and Velázquez was tasked with purchasing works and arranging for their transport to Madrid. He left in January of 1649 and would not return until June of 1651, more than 2 years later. This second trip to Italy was different from the first. He was no longer a young painter in search of knowledge. He was 50 years old, a celebrated artist, the court painter to the most powerful king in Europe. He traveled with an entourage, letters of credit, royal authority. He went to Venice, to Rome, to Naples, and in each city he was received with honors, invited to view private collections, given access to works that few outsiders ever saw. But he also painted. In Rome he painted 2 portraits that stand apart from everything else he had done. 2 works that seemed to exist outside the demands of the court, outside the conventions of portraiture, almost outside time. The first is a portrait of his assistant and servant, Juan de Pareja. Pareja was a man of mixed race, born into slavery, who had been with Velázquez for years, grinding his pigments, preparing his canvases, perhaps assisting with the underpainting of his works. In Rome, Velázquez painted him, and the portrait is astonishing. Pareja is shown in half-length, turned slightly to the left, looking directly at the viewer. He is dressed in a dark green cloak with a white collar, simple and dignified. His face is serious, intelligent, guarded. His skin is rendered with extraordinary subtlety, the warm tones modulated by light and shadow, every stroke visible, every decision clear. The background is a soft gray-brown, atmospheric, immaterial. The portrait was exhibited at the Pantheon in Rome in March of 1650, and it caused a sensation. According to one contemporary account, people said that all the other paintings looked like paintings, but this one looked alive. It was praised for its vitality, its immediacy, the sense that Pareja was not a representation but a presence. Shortly after the portrait was exhibited, Velázquez freed Pareja from slavery, granting him his liberty in a legal document signed in Rome. Whether the portrait was connected to that decision, whether it was a way of acknowledging Pareja's humanity before formalizing his freedom, we cannot know. But the 2 acts, painting him with such dignity, freeing him, feel of a piece, as if Velázquez was trying to make right, in his own limited way, a wrong he had participated in. The second portrait is of Pope Innocent X, painted in the spring of 1650. Innocent was a formidable man, 75 years old, suspicious, sharp-minded, known for his political acumen and his temper. Velázquez painted him seated, wearing his papal robes, white roche, red mozzetta, and cape, holding a petition in one hand. The reds are extraordinary, among the most brilliant passages of paint Velázquez ever laid down, layer upon layer of crimson and scarlet and vermilion, each one catching the light differently, vibrating against each other. But the face is what holds the painting together. Innocent looks out with an expression that is wary, intelligent, almost predatory. He is not a symbol of spiritual authority. He is a man who knows how power works, who trusts no one, who is always calculating. There is no flattery here, no piety, just the unflinching record of a personality. The painting was not commissioned. Velázquez painted it on his own initiative, perhaps as a demonstration of his skill, perhaps simply because he wanted to. Innocent was reportedly pleased with it, though one account suggests he found it too true, a phrase that captures exactly what Velázquez was doing, telling a truth that the conventions of portraiture usually obscured. But for all the success of those 2 years in Italy, for all the paintings he acquired, and the honors he received, Velázquez was also avoiding something. He was supposed to return to Madrid. The king wanted him back. Letters were sent, instructions were issued. But Velázquez kept delaying. He stayed in Rome, painting, acquiring works, enjoying the freedom of being away from the court. It is one of the few moments in his life when he seems to have acted on his own desires rather than his duties, and it suggests that the burden of service, the weight of being always available, always at the king's call, had become heavier than he usually allowed himself to acknowledge. Eventually, the king's patience ran out. Orders were sent. Velázquez returned to Madrid in June of 1651, more than 2 years after he had left. He brought with him crates of paintings and sculptures, acquisitions for the royal collection. He resumed his duties as court painter and palace chamberlain. He was welcomed back, his position secure. But something had shifted. The trip to Italy had reminded him of what it was like to paint freely, to be valued for his art rather than his administrative competence. And in the years that followed he would paint less and less, not because his skill had diminished, but because the demands of the court left him little time. There were still portraits to be made. In 1651, shortly after his return, he painted Mariana of Austria, Philip's second wife, whom the king had married in 1649 after the death of his first wife, Isabella of Bourbon. Mariana was young. She had been born in 1634, the same year as the portrait of Baltasar Carlosand. She was Philip's niece, the daughter of his sister Maria and the Emperor Ferdinand III. The marriage was dynastic, designed to strengthen the ties between the Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburg family, and it produced several children, though only 2 would survive to adulthood. Velázquez painted Mariana in the elaborate court costume of the time, an enormous farthingale skirt that spread out around her like a bell, a tight bodice, wide sleeves, her hair pulled back and decorated with ribbons and jewels. The costume was designed to project majesty, to make the queen into a kind of living architecture, imposing and impersonal. But Velázquez, as always, found the person inside the costume. Mariana's face is pale, her expression serious, almost melancholy. She looks younger than her years, fragile under the weight of the role. The painting is sympathetic, but it is also honest. This is a girl who has become a queen, and the transformation has not made her happy. He painted the infantas, the king's daughters, again and again. There is a portrait of the Infanta Maria Teresa, Philip's eldest surviving daughter from his first marriage, painted around 1652 to 1653. She would later marry Louis XIV of France, a marriage that was supposed to bring peace between Spain and France and that instead marked the beginning of Spain's long decline as a European power. But in 1653 she was a young woman, not yet 20, dressed in silver and white, her face calm, composed, dutiful. Velázquez painted her with a tenderness that suggests he saw her not as a political pawn, but as a person, someone whose life had been decided for her long before she had any say in it. And then there is the Infanta Margarita, Mariana's daughter, born in 1651. Velázquez painted her several times in the last years of his life, and she appears in his greatest painting, the one toward which his entire career had been moving, even if he did not know it until he stood in the room and saw the arrangement of figures and light and understood what he was about to make. The painting is called Las Meninas, though that title came later. Velázquez himself did not title it. In the royal inventories, it was listed simply as the family, and that is what it shows, or seems to show, a moment in the life of the court. The Infanta Margarita surrounded by her attendants, her ladies-in-waiting, a dwarf, a dog, a chaperone, a bodyguard. The scene is set in a large room in the Alcázar, the piazza principal of the apartments once occupied by Prince Baltasar Carlos, who had died 10 years earlier. The walls are hung with paintings, dark shapes barely visible in the shadows. Light pours in from a window on the right, illuminating the Infanta and her attendants. In the background a doorway opens onto a bright corridor, and a man, José Nieto, the Queen's chamberlain, is pausing on the stairs, looking back into the room. And on the left side of the canvas, half hidden in shadow, is Velázquez himself. He is standing in front of an enormous canvas, much larger than Las Meninas itself, holding a palette and a brush, looking out toward the viewer. On his chest he wears the Red Cross of the Order of Santiago, the military order that was a mark of nobility, though according to some accounts the cross was added later, after his death, because at the time he painted Las Meninas he had not yet been admitted to the order. The painting is large, nearly 10 feet tall and 9 feet wide, and it is both simple and impossible. At first, it seems straightforward. Velázquez is painting a portrait of the king and queen, who are standing where we, the viewers, are standing, and the Infanta has come into the room with her attendants to watch. We know the king and queen are there because we can see their reflections in a mirror on the back wall, 2 pale faces barely visible in the dim light. The Infanta has turned to look at them, and one of her meninas, her maids of honor, is curtsying. The scene is casual, almost informal, a pause in the work of painting. But the longer you look at it, the less simple it becomes. If Velázquez is painting the king and queen, why are they not the subject of Las Meninas? Why is the canvas turned away from us, so we cannot see what he is painting? Why is the Infanta the focus of the composition, if she is not the subject of the portrait being made within the painting? Or is she the subject? Is Velázquez painting the Infanta, not the king and queen, and the mirror is reflecting something else, some other arrangement we cannot see? Or is the painting we are looking at, Las Meninas itself, the painting that Velázquez is making within the painting, a kind of infinite loop in which the act of painting contains and is contained by the painting itself? These are not idle questions. They are the questions that make Las Meninas one of the most philosophically complex paintings ever made. It is a painting about looking, about who looks and who is looked at, about the relationship between the artist and the subject, between the viewer and the viewed. It collapses the distance between the world inside the painting and the world outside it. We stand where the king and queen stand, which means we are both the audience and the subject. We are watching the painting being made, and we are part of what is being made. The painting includes us in its world, but it also holds us at a distance, reminding us that we are looking at a surface, at pigment on canvas, at an illusion. Michel Foucault wrote about Las Meninas at length in The Order of Things, arguing that it was a representation of representation itself, a meditation on the structures of visibility and knowledge. He saw in it the moment when the classical episteme, the way of organizing and understanding the world that had dominated European thought since the Renaissance, began to break down, when the certainty of vision gave way to the recognition that what we see is always mediated, always shaped by perspective and position. Other philosophers and art historians have offered their own interpretations, each finding in the painting a different key to its mystery. But perhaps the simplest way to understand Las Meninas is as a portrait of service and presence. Velázquez spent his entire life painting other people, the king, the queen, the royal family, the courtiers, the dwarves. He painted them with a dignity and attention that granted them a kind of immortality. But he himself remained invisible, the maker behind the image, the servant whose work was to make others seen. In Las Meninas, he includes himself. He steps into the painting, looks out at us, and asserts his presence. He is not just the painter. He is a participant, a witness, a figure of equal weight to the Infanta and her attendants. And by placing himself in the painting, by showing himself at work, he is claiming a status that his social position denied him, the status of an artist, not just a craftsman, someone whose vision matters, whose presence is worth recording. The painting was finished in 1656 when Velázquez was 57 years old. It hung in the king's private rooms, where few people would have seen it. It was not exhibited publicly. It was not written about in Velázquez's lifetime. It was simply there, one painting among many in the royal collection, remarkable, but not yet recognized as the singular achievement it would later be seen to be. After Las Meninas, Velázquez painted less. The demands of his position as palace chamberlain were consuming. In 1659 he was given the enormous task of organizing the festivities for the marriage of the Infanta Maria Teresa to Louis XIV, a wedding that took place on the border between Spain and France, on the Isle of Fessence in the Bidassoa River, in June of 1660. The preparations were elaborate, requiring months of planning, the coordination of logistics, the oversight of ceremonies that had to reflect the grandeur and dignity of both courts. Velázquez managed it all, traveling to the border, overseeing the construction of temporary pavilions, arranging the seating, the protocol, the presentation of gifts. The wedding took place on June 9, 1660. A few weeks later, Velázquez returned to Madrid, exhausted. In early August, he fell ill, probably with a fever. On August 6, 1660, he died. He was 61 years old. He was buried the next day in the church of San Juan Bautista in Madrid, with the honors due to a Knight of the Order of Santiago, the honor he had spent years lobbying for and had finally received in 1659, less than a year before his death. Juana survived him by only a week. She died on August 14th and was buried beside him. We do not know if her death was related to his, if grief or illness took her, or if it was simply coincidence, the kind of unhappy timing that erases a life from the record before anyone thinks to note it down. They had been married for 42 years, and we know almost nothing about their relationship except that it lasted, that they had 2 daughters, that she stayed in Madrid while he traveled, that she managed his household while he served the king. She is another silence, another gap in the story that cannot be filled. Velázquez left behind no writings, no letters, no journal. He did not theorize about his art. He did not explain his methods. He did not leave instructions for his students, because he had almost no students. His son-in-law, Mazo, continued to paint in his manner, producing works that were often mistaken for Velázquez's own. But Mazo was an imitator, not an innovator. The subtlety of Velázquez's technique, the way he used loose, visible brush strokes to suggest form, the way he balanced precision and spontaneity was too personal, too intuitive, to be codified into a teachable method. For more than a century after his death, Velázquez was respected but not celebrated. His works remained in the royal collection, largely invisible to the wider world. The Spanish court declined, its power eroded by wars and economic stagnation, and with it, the visibility of the art it had produced. The great movements of European art in the 18th century, the Rococo, the rise of neoclassicism happened elsewhere, in France, in Italy, in England. Spanish painting was seen as provincial, isolated, old-fashioned. It was not until the 19th century when the Prado Museum in Madrid opened its doors and made the royal collection accessible to the public that Velázquez began to be rediscovered. Artists traveling to Spain to see the works of Goya stayed to look at Velázquez and found in his paintings something that spoke to their own concerns, their own dissatisfaction with the academic conventions of their time. The French painter Édouard Manet made the pilgrimage to Madrid in 1865 and was overwhelmed by what he saw. "I have found my master," he wrote. "Velázquez alone justifies the journey." Manet saw in Velázquez a precedent for everything he was trying to do, the rejection of smooth finish in favor of visible brushwork, the flattening of pictorial space, the emphasis on the act of painting itself as the subject of painting itself, as the subject of painting itself, as the subject of painting. Other artists followed. James McNeill Whistler studied Velázquez and absorbed his lesson about the relationship between figure and ground, the way a portrait could be as much about the space around the figure as the figure itself. John Singer Sargent copied Velázquez's paintings in the Prado and learned from him how to paint fabric, how to render the play of light on satin and velvet with just a few strokes. The English painter Francis Bacon, in the 20th century, became obsessed with Velázquez's portrait of Pope Innocent X, painting dozens of variations on it, screaming popes trapped in glass boxes, the original's cool intelligence transformed into existential terror. Las Meninas became a touchstone, a painting that seemed to predict the concerns of modernism, self-reflexivity, the instability of perspective, the questioning of representation itself. Pablo Picasso painted 44 variations on Las Meninas in 1957, breaking it down, reconstructing it, trying to understand how Velázquez had achieved what he had achieved. The painting was analyzed, written about, theorized, turned into a symbol of the self-consciousness of art. It became, in a sense, too famous, so encrusted with interpretation, that it was difficult to see the actual painting beneath the weight of what had been said about it. But the other works, the portraits of the dwarfs, the Bodegons, the late portraits of the royal family, retained their quiet power. They did not need to be theorized, they simply were, and they offered to anyone willing to look slowly and carefully a model for what painting could be, not a demonstration of skill, not a vehicle for narrative or allegory, but a way of attending to the world, a way of granting presence and dignity to whatever and whomever it turned its gaze upon. Velázquez's achievement is difficult to summarize because it is not reducible to a single innovation or a single masterpiece. He did not invent a new genre or a new technique. He did not lead a movement or gather a school of followers. What he did was quieter and more radical. He changed what a painting could see, what it could acknowledge, what it could grant value to. He painted kings and queens, and he painted servants and dwarfs, and he painted them all with the same attention, the same refusal to simplify or idealize. He worked within the constraints of a rigidly hierarchical society, a society that defined people by their birth and their role, and he used his art to insist that those definitions were not the whole truth, that there was something else, something irreducible and human, that could be made visible if you were willing to look. The tension at the heart of his life, the artist who served and who wanted to be more than a servant, never fully resolved. He spent decades lobbying for honors, for titles, for recognition of his status as a gentleman, and he achieved some of that before he died. But the honors came late, and they came because of his service, not his art. The Order of Santiago that he wears in Las Meninas was granted to him because he had proved his lineage, because he had demonstrated that he was of noble blood, not because he had painted the most extraordinary portraits of his century. The social hierarchy he lived within did not have a place for the idea that an artist's work might ennoble him, that the act of making something beautiful and true might be worth more than an inherited title. And yet, his work outlasted that hierarchy. Spain's empire collapsed. The Habsburgs lost their throne. The court that employed him, the palace where he worked, the system of patronage and power that defined his life, all of it, faded into history. But the paintings remain, and they carry a vision of human dignity that is more enduring than any empire. The old woman cooking eggs, Sebastian de Mora sitting on the floor, the Infanta Margarita surrounded by her attendants, Pope Innocent in his red robes, Philip IV with his tired eyes, all of them are still here, still present, still looking out at us across the centuries. Velázquez died in Madrid in the summer of 1660, at the height of his career and the end of his strength. He had spent his life making other people visible, and in doing so, he had made himself visible too, not as a servant or a functionary or even as a knight, but as an artist, someone who saw clearly and painted honestly, who refused to flatter or simplify, who understood that the work of painting was also the work of recognition, of acknowledging the presence and the worth of whoever stood before him. There is a late portrait of Philip IV, painted in the last years of Velázquez's life, probably around 1655 or 1656. The king is older now, in his 50s, his face sagging, his hair gray, his expression exhausted. He has been king for more than 30 years. He has seen his empire shrink, his armies defeated, his son die. He is married again, had more children, buried more children, buried more children. He is still the king, still the most powerful man in Spain, but the paint does not lie. He looks tired. He looks like a man who has carried a burden too long and knows he will carry it until he dies. Velázquez painted him without pity and without cruelty, just with the patient attention that had always been his method. He saw the king as he was, and he painted what he saw. It is a portrait of service, yes, but it is also a portrait of dignity, of two men who had known each other for more than 30 years, who had aged together, who had both spent their lives in roles that required them to be more than they were, and to endure the gap between what was required and what was possible. Philip IV outlived Velázquez by 5 years. He died in 1665, worn out, his kingdom in decline, his legacy uncertain. The portraits Velázquez painted of him remain, dozens of them, a record of a life lived under the scrutiny of history and rendered by an artist who understood that scrutiny was also a form of care, that to be seen clearly was not to be diminished but to be made real. In the end, Velázquez's work is not about mastery or virtuosity, though it is full of both. It is about looking, about the slow, patient act of attending to what is there, and about the belief that such attention is a kind of respect, a way of acknowledging that the people and things we look at matter, that they have weight and presence and dignity simply by virtue of existing. He spent his life painting other people, and in doing so, he gave them a kind of immortality. But he also gave himself one, not by asserting his genius or his importance, but by the quiet accumulation of work, painting after painting, each one a small act of recognition, a small refusal to look away. The paintings hang in museums now, in Madrid and Vienna and London and New York. They are studied, admired, written about. Las Meninas is reproduced in every art history textbook, analyzed in every survey of Baroque painting. The portrait of Pope Innocent is called one of the greatest portraits ever made. The late portraits of the royal family are praised for their psychological depth. The Bodegones are recognized as precursors to modernism, early examples of realism's power to dignify the everyday. But perhaps the best way to understand Velázquez is not to read about him or to theorize about his work, but simply to stand in front of one of his paintings and look, to look slowly, the way he looked, and to let the painting reveal itself, to see how the brushstrokes, which seem loose and almost careless up close, resolve into solidity and presence when you step back, to notice how the light falls, how the colors shimmer, how the faces seem to breathe, to realize that what you are looking at is not a representation, but a presence, not an image, but an encounter, the record of one person's attention to another, made visible in paint. Velázquez painted in an age of kings and empires, of rigid hierarchies and absolute power. He served that world faithfully, and he also, quietly, subverted it by insisting through his work that everyone he painted, king or servant, noble or dwarf, pope or child, was equally worthy of being seen, equally deserving of the slow, careful attention that granted them their humanity. He did not write manifestos or make grand statements. He simply painted year after year, portrait after portrait, attending to what was there, refusing to simplify or idealize, trusting that the act of looking clearly was itself a kind of truth. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.